Welcome to this PharmAla webinar where we're speaking to our friends at Clerkenwell Health. Just going to give folks a couple of minutes to join in. I'm expecting quite a few folks. And then we will dive right into the webinar. While we wait, George, Henry, why don't you guys introduce yourself real quick?
George, you go first.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Henry. Thanks for having me on, Nick, and thank you for the team at PharmAla for putting this on and for the audience for listening. I'm George McBride. I'm a co-founder and the Chief Commercial Officer here at Clerkenwell Health. I have had a wide and varied career, but started as a barrister, a commercial court litigator, and then took a serious departure from that into the world of drug policy and psychoactive drug research, working at the Beckley Foundation in 2015, which is where I met Henry, who'd just been finishing his PhD in Oxford while he was working at the Beckley Foundation. And then I worked at a non-for-profit called Voltfast that led the charge for the legalization of medical cannabis here in the UK. Built a cannabis advisory business called Hanway Associates, which is still going strong, and then moved back into psychedelics to build Clerkenwell Health with the team, including Henry, that I've been working with for many years. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, so it's always helpful when George introduces himself first because it means that he's done 90% of my job as well. So my background is originally in chemistry, so I did a PhD in pharmaceutical chemistry at Oxford, which happened to focus on various kind of CNS psychiatric drugs by a mix of kind of chance and design. And that kind of led me to the research on psychedelics, which then led me on to a job at the Beckley Foundation, where, as George mentioned, I met him, and my career then has kind of taken a fairly similar pathway to George's ever since. Drug policy reform, advocacy, and the cannabis industry. But ultimately, I was kind of most interested in psychedelics. And so when the opportunity arose to found Clerkenwell three or so years ago, we then started to form that, and we've been building Clerkenwell Health ever since, which is a psychedelic specialist CRO and site network.
Very cool. Well, why don't we guys? Why don't we talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing together? Because I think that'd be sort of interesting to folks, and I think it's a good entree to what Clerkenwell does for sort of all of its clients.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been working with PharmAla on your research program, so less to do with the kind of MDMA supply side of things and more on actual kind of clinical research and clinical development, which is obviously our focus as an organization. In particular, we've been engaging with regulators, so the FDA and MHRA, on your plans to develop one of your drug candidates called ALA-002 through to clinical development. So obtaining an understanding from regulators what preclinical requirements are necessary, and also what clinical trial design requirements are kind of necessary in the kind of first iteration when we kind of go to the kind of first in human or first in patient trials.
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't expect that you guys monitor what we talk about at PharmAla, but the reality is, because of the change in Australia, I think for the first half of the year, like all we were talking about all the time was the generic MDMA work, right? The manufacturing and the sales and our joint venture Cortexa, and we haven't really been talking a lot about the research that we've been doing in Harpreet's department. So you know, I think this is a great opportunity to sort of get into the world of clinical trials and what that means for a company like ours, or or other companies that you guys work with.
The exciting stuff, as far as kind of I could see it, in terms of finding new and improved drugs rather than the ones that we already have. So do you want to go into a little bit of
sure,
research approach and what ALA-002 is? So MDMA is a chiral molecule, which means it has a kind of left-handed version and a right-handed version in kind of lay terms. Non-standard MDMA, or what's called racemic MDMA, essentially has an equal 50-50 split of both those enantiomers, is what it's called. But what PharmAla are developing is a non-racemic mixture, so it has more of one hand than the other, but it's not solely just one type entirely. So two different enantiomers of MDMA have quite different pharmacologies, but what makes them really interesting is that they have quite kind of complementary synergistic pharmacologies. So one is more amphetamine-like, stimulant-like, and the other is a lot more kind of empathogenic, kind of verging on psychedelic. What ALA-002 is focused on is it has more of the R enantiomer, which is the more kind of empathogenic one, and less of the S enantiomer, which is the more stimulating one. Yeah. What is hoped that will transpire into clinical effects is a more beneficial safety profile and hopefully an improved efficacy as well. I don't know, Nick, if you want to kind of go into any more of the
look, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of sort of the intent and the effect. Look, so we're somewhat limited in what we can say about what the regulatory response was, right? But like maybe in broad strokes, like what did you guys sort of expect the regulators to say, and did they meet your expectations? Maybe we can try to couch it in those terms.
Totally. So as I said, we kind of went to two regulators for this to kind of understand what their thoughts were, and I suppose what the approach in going with a compound that is already reasonably well researched with MDMA, but using a non-enantiomeric, non-racemic mixture, is it means there's a whole load of data that we can kind of build on to present a case that means you don't have to start from scratch with preclinical testing, and certainly with some of the clinical work that he's doing in terms of healthy volunteers. We understand a good deal of each enantiomer's pharmacology and how they interact, and so there's a lot that you can kind of build a case around to mean that a lot of that early work can be bypassed, and that's essentially the case that we made to regulators, both to the FDA and the MHRA. I suppose that kind of maybe leads on to why you might want to do that, and then the kind of approach that I guess intelligent clinical development should be taking, which is you could obviously take the approach that the US might be your target market, and so it's only worth engaging with the FDA and kind of working through that way. But that kind of leaves out a whole bunch of options and tools in terms of kind of clinical development, so that are kind of open to drug developers, because different regulators will have different approaches, different requirements, and different tolerances for what they like to see in terms of safety and efficacy. And so by taking the kind of same argument to different regulators, you can see the FDA is quite well known for being very stepwise and methodical in its approach. Obviously, that can be useful sometimes because you kind of know where you stand with them, which is usually at the very beginning. And with other regulators,
it's easy to know where you stand when it's always at ground zero. It's like the bottom.
Exactly.
I mean, for those folks who don't know, the FDA is like notorious for this stuff. Like, folks will do clinical trials in like other very comparable countries, like well-established countries, and the US will say like, we will not accept these trial findings unless you also do a clinical trial in the US. Like, people in the US are super special and different, and we must do a trial here.
Yeah. So what the FDA typically likes to see to get a drug approved or for an ID is they want to see all the homework being done, all the kind of preclinical work, healthy volunteer studies that are done. But often that's not really practical to do a lot of that.
Well, not practical, and like, look, this is just my opinion, but also not necessary. So Laura from your team posted a tweet a little while ago that it was like a question. It was like, what is the value of healthy volunteer studies in psychedelics? And I really wanted to reply and be like, there is none. I mean, like, you know, I make this joke all the time, but if we were doing drug discovery in a reasonable and logical way, then the drug that's been like used illicitly by people for 5,000 years because it's derived from a mushroom and people were eating the mushroom with like variable dosages and unknown sort of metabolites and everything else, and like no one's dying, that's a really safe drug. Like, you don't need to do a lot of healthy volunteer studies, because I guarantee you there's people up and down British Columbia who are doing your healthy volunteer study right now with mushrooms that they found in their yard.
And there's a compassionate argument there as well, which is, if you can be doing studies in a patient population and understanding whether it's going to work and putting your money towards the most effective kind of clinical development program, because you know which targets are going to stand most chance of being effective, then that's a better approach and a more efficient approach, rather where you can fill in the healthy volunteer work and any missing preclinical work at a later date, but you already know which is the best horse to be kind of betting on at an earlier stage. And so that's really what we hoped to be doing in the project.
I mean, like, I don't know what your take on this is, but this is why I'm a big supporter of right to try legislation in the United States, where there is a bill to allow for controlled substances to be used under right to try, because that gives you an opportunity to sort of develop this real world data amongst people who are, I mean, listen, they're terminally ill anyways. And to your point about compassionate use, like, who are we to deny somebody who is like terminally ill with cancer the right to try, you know, MDMA or psilocybin for their end of life anxiety? That seems like a very, very easy like layup to me. Yeah. But again, I don't make policy in the United States.
No, and there's, you know, safety isn't an objective quality of anything, you know, it's a risk assessment piece. Totally. And there is some credibility to the FDA approach, really just push everything through the exact same process, and there is a fairness in that, and there's a reliability in it, but it does skew towards favoring people with long timelines, deep pockets, and entirely novel compounds, rather than the very different kind of biotech world around psychedelic molecules, which tends to be people with shallower pockets, investors with an expectation of shorter timelines, and compounds that are either already fairly well understood, if not as well studied as we'd like, or compounds like yours that are starting to move beyond and change, but are still rooted in things that we understand.
Yeah. So look, I think that's a great sort of lead into, you know, like you talked a little bit about how you guys started Clerkenwell. What makes Clerkenwell different than other CROs that, you know, like there's lots of CROs in biotech and pharma, obviously, but you guys have like a very specific sort of niche focus that I think is very, very useful for folks to sort of know about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of goes back to, I suppose, the origin of when we were thinking of what to do with Clerkenwell. We saw an influx in commercial interest in psychedelics, and we wanted to do something that would push the sector as a whole in the direction that we felt it should go, and kind of lift all boats. So we spoke to a whole host of drug developers at the time, and kind of looked at the field and assessed what was most needed. And what came back loud and clear is a kind of psychedelic specialist CRO service that could provide a kind of full suite service for conducting clinical trials, is what was most needed. That kind of really understood the kind of unique conceptual and pragmatic requirements of psychedelics, but also kind of commercial sensibilities as well. And kind of mainstream CROs maybe had the commercial knowledge, but not really a great deal of the understanding of psychedelics, or what was necessary to run trials in this area. And academics in the space perhaps understood some of the challenges of running these trials, but aren't terribly commercial or good with timelines. So we tried to kind of fill that space.
And I think it's worth pointing out for anyone who's new to the kind of drug development process, drug developers, biotechs don't run their own research by and large, almost exclusively these days. And so they contract all of that out. There's a very well-established and highly competitive market for services for contract research. But we felt that what psychedelics needed was a different approach and not something that was already offered in the market. The research that was being conducted to date when we started looking at this in earnest in 2019 was being done, in a room at the end of the corridor on a psychiatric ward of a university hospital, or in phase 1 units that have maybe 200 beds and are running vaccine trials concurrently with oncology trials, concurrently with psychedelic trials. And what there wasn't a focus on is two main things. One being that there's a larger number of variables that need controlling for in a psychedelic study, because you've got things like mindset and the setting in which the treatment is being conducted, which can create added variables in the treatment. And the other thing being the importance of the kind of user experience, to put it in like tech language, for the participants. Most of the one of the biggest problems that the research was facing was not being able to recruit enough eligible patients and then not being able to retain them on the trials. And part of that, we felt, was down to the kind of cookie cutter approach you get from a lot of larger, well-established contract research organizations who are used to doing a lot of research, but mental health research had been kind of underserved over the last 20 years. So there wasn't as much experience in how to attract and retain those patients, and not as much focus put on the added levels of care and consideration that vulnerable cohort need in research. So what we wanted to do was something that isn't normally done, which is integrating within one company the sites that conduct the research and the teams that manage the trials, ensure that risks are mitigated and avoided, and communicate with regulators. So we have separate site teams and CRO team, but we work together to ensure that there's consistency in the approach right through our organization, which is not something that the CROs normally have. Yeah, that's a little bit about us. Nick, how did you come to find us? I can't remember how we found each other.
I don't remember. It might have been Mindset. I know you guys do some work obviously with Mindset as well, and they're partners of ours. I don't actually remember how this came about, but I remember that you pitched me and it was a good pitch. So you have that in your corner. The pitch was good. I'll just take a moment here and let everyone know, if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. You can start now. We'll probably get to them in about 5-10 minutes. We'll keep talking a little bit more and then we'll get into some questions. But yeah, please feel free to put them in the chat as we go forward. So tell me a little bit about from where you guys sit, where's the trend line? Where are things going with clinical trials? I think for an investor audience, which I think a number of the folks seeing some of the names in the participant list, I think a lot of folks are investors. What's happening in the world of clinical trials? Because I think there's a lag time between what happens in the market and what happens in clinical trials. Yeah,
so I think one of the trends, at least that regulators are trying to drive, and I think that's most relevant within trials within psychedelics in particular, is a drive towards kind of adaptive trial design and kind of multi-stage trials. So rather than taking the kind of traditional stepwise approach of doing a phase 1A and then maybe a phase 1B and then a phase 2A and waiting for the results to come out each time, what regulators like to see, and what really suits psychedelics quite well, where again we have a lot of this knowledge in hand, so we're not starting from scratch where you need to know the results of any given stage before you can start designing the second at all. Designing multi-stage trials where the results from the first stage, whether it's a dose finding stage or kind of safety pharmacology stage, then feed straight into the next stage. And that saves a huge amount of time with regulators. It saves a huge amount of time in terms of kind of trial submissions, and kind of means that you can actually make each stage more efficient because you can build in a whole series of rules. So that's one of the things that we've certainly focused on very much as a company when it's come to kind of designing trials for clients, and it's something that's been very well received by regulators as well. So that's something that we've seen a real push for. More broadly,
there was, a huge amount of optimism from investors in particular in sort of 2018-19, led to a huge influx of capital and a dramatic shift in the state of the sector, going from whatever there was one commercial organization in 2013 through to then suddenly dozens and then in over 100 developers by sort of late 2019.
Crazy, right?
And then that dramatic shift in the kind of sentiment and macroeconomic situation that made it a lot more challenging period to raise funds from 2020 to now. And so there has been some attrition in the market. There have been a lot of companies that have failed to execute or failed to raise sufficient funds to deliver their clinical trials. So there was a big influx of trials being designed, submitted, and approved. And then we've seen that slow a little bit over the last year or so as people are being a bit more selective in what they're pursuing. And I think a lot of that is rational, but the market inherently always tends to swing from one end to another rather than finding a happy medium ground. So we're going to see that there's less in terms of new trials being started, but we've now got to the point where there is quite a lot of live phase 2 trials, and there should be an exciting time coming very soon where we start to see multiple phase 3 trials of psychedelic compounds running globally. And that's something which the infrastructure still hasn't really been built for. MAPS had to work very hard building the groundwork and utilizing all of the sites that they did to deliver a phase 3 trial. And there is still, part of what we're trying to do is build that infrastructure for companies like PharmAla looking at second generation compounds, and build that infrastructure so that they can then, take these through the full development cycle and run big international phase 3s. And that's where the really exciting stuff happens, because a lot of treatments look promising in phase 2, but then can't be replicated at a much larger scale. So that's going to be where it starts to be really interesting to see if that infrastructure can be built, the results of phase 2s can be replicated in larger cohorts, and whether starting to get an idea of whether this is actually viable as, a part of the larger healthcare system internationally, which is still very much an unknown, whether these can be commercially delivered. Obviously, there's a lot of hope, a lot of promise, a lot of promising data, but they're still very limited in the larger end of it. So we're hoping that the next few years for us will be building some of that infrastructure and the teams that will deliver those much, much larger trials. But there needs to be a bridge built to the existing pharmaceutical industry who have the deep pockets and can run those larger trials. There aren't any of the psychedelic drug developers who are sat on billions of dollars of cash reserves. Unfortunately, they are going to need to either raise a lot more money or build a bridge to those larger organizations who can run those trials.
Look, in traditional pharma, the way this works is out licensing. So you develop IP and then you out license it to a larger pharma company and they take it through. The issue is, from my perspective, and again, this is just me, but unfortunately, there are a lot of companies out there that don't really have great IP assets.
That's the big change, I think, that has become apparent in the last kind of 12 months, especially in the sector, where those companies that didn't have very intelligent IP strategies have that's come back to haunt them. Plowing millions of pounds into a clinical development plan that is just trying to take psilocybin forwards for depression, like however many other companies. It doesn't leave much in terms of a clear water between your own IP strategy and anyone else's. So finding intelligent ways to kind of protect target compounds and go in kind of different directions allows there to be something that can be kind of out licensed at a later stage.
Yeah, and we've really enjoyed working with companies like you and Mindset and others who are trying to have a more intelligent approach that's trying to do things differently, but being accepting of the reality of how the current system works and working within that and pushing boundaries. But there was a lot of just kind of blind optimism in the early days that is quite happy. I'm quite happy to see that having passed, really. Like I said,
let's not be happy that a bunch of companies have gone bankrupt and like say it that way. It doesn't sound super great, man. But yeah, look, I think the market is really good at sort of like, you know, the truth will out. So I hope that I appreciate what you said about us. We have tried really hard to sort of develop something that is like, number one, net new. Like, you need novelty, because otherwise what are you patenting? I really strongly don't believe in, like, I know that there are some companies in this space that will like patent the paint color for the walls of a treatment room, and I don't believe in that. I think you should have like something truly novel, but also working within like the existing confines of what we know. Like, it's actually a very tough needle to thread, and we've tried very, very hard to thread it. The interesting thing is that now, so we have the ALA series, which is a novel and anti-emeric mix of MDMA. We have the ABA series, which is a novel and anti-emeric mix of MBDB, which is another molecule, very similar to MDMA, although not controlled everywhere, in many places not controlled substance. But now where Harpreet is really going with her work is like totally new molecules that are still like in the same class as MDMA, but maybe have like more psychedelic effects, that have maybe like the ability to trigger neuronal growth in the way that some of the other psychedelics do, which MDMA does not. MDMA doesn't. This stuff, like I get off on this stuff, so please, you know, stop me. There's a really, really great article a little while ago that basically, quite convincingly, in my opinion, argued that the trigger for neuronal growth in psychedelics is a question of, does the molecule get past the cell membrane and into the cell? And if it binds to the serotonin receptor outside of the cell, then like that's like MDMA. That does not trigger any neuronal growth. But if it binds to the serotonin receptors inside the cell, because it's permeated the cell membrane, then you get like neuroplasticity, neuronal growth, all this cool stuff. So knowing that now, you know, Harpreet is actively at work finding molecules that can do that. So super cool stuff.
And that was a really interesting discovery, because it was kind of the first real step forwards that we've seen at kind of really kind of molecular level, our understanding of what psychedelics do at that level in a long time. And it kind of opens the door a little bit to a whole load of drug design kind of opportunities that psychedelics haven't really kind of pushed on yet. We, you know, a lot of what's being done still really is kind of trawling through Pickal and Tickal, which I know that it's still the Bible, but you know, and trying to find what's molecules that have been discovered 30 years or so ago, and then trying to kind of optimize them slightly. But there's a whole wealth of new stuff.
Yeah.
New stuff.
Well, yeah, mechanism of action is not super well understood in this space. Like regulators don't care, right? It just has to work. We don't really care how it works. It just has to be effective.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-boggling for a non-scientist like me to realize just how many different psychoactive compounds there are potentially out there. You know, I don't think many people outside of this field would realize just how many hundreds of thousands.
Just inside the MDXX class, which is sort of what we like to call the sort of the analogs of MDMA. Like, there's dozens of new molecules that we have looked at, and some we think have a great chance of being successful, and others we think have no chance of being successful. There's a patent recently for that was published by another company that shall not be named for methylone. So methylone is another sort of, it's not quite an MDMA analog, but it's also like a molecule that's sort of somewhat close. We looked at that one super early, and we decided to stay away because like it has a huge abuse liability, like it's very addictive. But there's companies who are looking at that too. So Like there's so many molecules out there that people are just starting to dive into.
I think what's interesting, obviously, with psychedelics and pathogens, because people can experience their effects subjectively, it allows a much greater understanding of actually the kind of variety of effects that drugs can kind of have. You know, when you don't have any kind of subjective understanding of the differences that different drugs cause, there's no way of understanding the kind of chemical landscape, but people can get a greater understanding of it when they can see that there's a whole wealth of different compounds that make them feel different ways very subtly.
Totally. So look, that's actually a great line into the first question. So I think we'll jump into Q&A now. As I said earlier, please do write out some questions. Happy to address whatever. We can't tell you everything, obviously, because some stuff is still sort of privileged as we work through like patents or regulators, but we will try to address whatever we can. Conway, do you want to read out the first question?
Absolutely. So this one is for George and Henry. Designing a controlled clinical trial in psychedelics is tough due to the obvious subjective effect. What are some of your tips and tricks to overcome this challenge?
So I mean, there's a number of challenges that obviously are fundamental to designing any of these trials, blinding and expectancy being kind of the core ones. And with blinding, there isn't a simple solution to it. People are going to know whether they've taken a drug that's so profoundly psychoactive as any kind of.
Although surprisingly, some of them sometimes don't,
yeah.
Which has shocked me. There's some people inaccurately calling that they're on the placebo. Yeah. Despite being under the influence of quite powerful drugs.
So people that are
does happen
having a powerful mystical experience when they've been on the placebo. I think they're the most
right. People will just be like, yeah, like I went to DMT land and really they just had sugar pill.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The placebo effect is very powerful. Don't knock it. You know.
And there's an interesting complex relationship between the kind of placebo effect when it comes to psychedelics and when compared to any other class of compounds, where that some of that suggestibility and expectancy may actually be kind of synergistic with the kind of core cognitive effects of the drug itself. So there's not any kind of quick fixes. The only things that kind of, or some of the things that we make sure that we include in all our trials that we design is that we include measures of blinding and measures of expectancy, so that at least it can be understood and accounted for in as much as these things can be accounted for. There are ways of kind of delivering preparation sessions and the kind of information to participants that leaves the door open for them to kind of have some questions about how they interpret their subjective experience and whether that means they're on the active compound or not. You can obviously use active placebos, or you can use placebos that are kind of sub-perceptual doses. So at least you can say everyone got the drug, it's just you got it in different amounts. Those aren't without issue, because you still have to interpret the kind of effects of an active placebo or at a sub-perceptual dose. But they at least allow kind of alternatives. And one of the challenges, you can make a trial design really complicated to account for that, but it also makes it a lot more expensive. So there kind of always has to be a line.
Totally. That's always a challenge.
How ironclad do you want your results to
I mean, I think we went back and forth like 15 times on our proposed trial design, right? Because like we always, you want to go out and find more data, but then that adds cost and complexity and it makes things slower. And so there's always this like push and pull where you want to do more, but then you have to reel yourself back all the time.
I think an important consideration as well that's often overlooked is that while there is a whole bundle of issues of complexity around psychedelic research, when you disentangle those into individual issues, hardly any of them, or even potentially none of them, are novel issues. No. There are real substantial problems with researching, as we were talking about the other day, surgery type interventions, or talking therapies. There are whole bodies of research which have been devoted to improving the quality of research in different fields that have very similar or the same issues with psychedelic research. So the important thing is we're standing on the shoulders of giants, you know, and there's a whole body of research around all of these different issues. So it's trying to disentangle them, find comparable approaches that have been used in comparable fields and integrate them in. The problem that you've got with psychedelics is it's just the layering of complexity on top of each other, and then the finite resources available to developers is the big issue. But there are a lot of ways to try and improve the quality of the research that are well understood and that we can utilize. It's about borrowing approaches from research that's already been done.
Yeah, totally. Conway, do you want to move on to the next question?
Absolutely. This one's for Nick. Can you speak to the strategy that PharmAla has taken to de-risk the clinical strategy?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, first and foremost, I think we made a conscious decision to build a cash flow generating business so we could pay for the research. I think that's step one of de-risking your research, is making sure that you could actually pay for it. But two, in designing ALA, we sort of found something that was novel and had novel effects, but was still based on a well understood and well characterized molecule. So I think that's a huge part of our strategy, is, you know, the less newness there is, the easier it gets to find the answers that you're looking for. The other thing that we did is, you know, the indication that we're going after is social anxiety in an autistic population. And there's actually already been a very successful phase 2 trial. It was an investigator-sponsored trial at UCLA, put together by Charles Grob's lab with Alicia Danforth as the lead. It was published as Danforth et al., I think 2018. And so they looked at social anxiety in autistics with just generic MDMA, and they found really, really durable results. And so, you know, we're very confident that ALA is going to work because, well, generic MDMA works. That's one. And two, in a preclinical model for rodents, we found that like ALA was even better for the autistic rodent model than generic MDMA. So, you know, you find an improved version, and then you find a trial that already is successful, and then, you know, at that point you're functionally replicating rather than doing something completely fresh, which really lowers your risk profile. Basically, it's easier to repeat science and do it all anew. Yeah, so that's our strategy. Any other questions? I think we've actually run out of questions. This never happens. Last time there was endless questions.
I'm assuming that's because we've been so comprehensive and not so dull.
It's 100% because as soon as you start talking about clinical trials, everyone goes to sleep immediately. This is why we only talk about, now you know why we only talk about the generic MDMA business, is because that would keep people awake. Well, look, if there are no other questions, I mean, maybe I'll give you guys like a little bit of an open forum. Anything else you guys want to talk about?
I suppose one of the things that we didn't quite touch on, but that I was going to mention when we were talking about what might be coming next and what the landscape might be looking at.
About what's coming next.
It kind of touches on, I guess, where there is still a lot of unknowns, and it goes down to the fact there are a lot of non-drug factors in this research that drug developers don't really necessarily have the funds or kind of focus to put money into yet, but that will be crucial that we kind of answer, you know, what types of therapy, what factors in setting are going to influence outcomes most strongly, what states and traits in patients are most likely to kind of predict positive outcomes or kind of stronger responses. And those questions are starting to be answered, some of them at the moment, but they're not being answered yet. But they will need to be answered when these drugs reach the market and when there's kind of being delivered in clinical practice, or before that. And so the results of trials that kind of answer those questions, I think, are going to be really interesting over the next kind of couple of years. and when kind of obviously Australia opens up to delivering MDMA and psilocybin therapy. So I think that's something that is going to be exciting to kind of see, and something that we're kind of going to be keeping a very close eye on.
I think it's real world data, which is always incredibly valuable, like Australia is. So I think that's incredibly exciting. But the other thing is, I think what you're going to see, having experienced this in a couple of other industries, is as soon as Australia opens up, you're going to get stories from people like veterans or first responders who go through these therapies for either PTSD or depression, and it works for them. It's not going to work for everybody, of course. Like I always want to temper people's expectations. Like, these are not miracle cures. They are effective for a certain subset of the population. But like, you're still going to get a whole bunch of people who sort of say like, hey, listen, this was great. Like, this really helped me. And like, that creates this virtuous cycle where you have like lots of people coming out and saying this helped. And then, more people want to try it. More governments are open to, deregulating it and making it available to people. And so I actually think that like, this is the start of the real spin up of the industry, is when you actually have a country like Australia, big population, that starts moving forward. I think only a matter of time before like UK, Canada, Brazil just start moving as a result. Do you want to, we have a bunch more questions, actually. They've magically appeared. So Conway, do you want to go back to the questions?
Absolutely. This is from Kent. This is regarding the non-control analog. If efficacy is proved, can it go directly to market?
No. So non-controlled means it's not a controlled substance, and that means that it's a lot cheaper for us to do the research, but you still need to get drug approval. So no, it cannot go straight to market. Sorry. That'd be nice, though.
All right, this is from Anonymous. How does Cortexa work into the clinical strategy, or does it not? How is the regulatory landscape in the USA or Australia versus Canada versus the UK versus the rest of the world? And how would MAPS influence the psychedelics? How would MAPS approval influence the psychedelic market space?
Maybe I'll take the first one, guys, because Cortexa is us, and then you guys can jump in on the second one.
Yeah,
that's perfect.
So look, Cortexa is really, really interesting for a couple of reasons in terms of our drug development. The first is, of course, like having like an entity within Australia that we're already utilizing for sales means that we can also potentially utilize it for clinical research. And Australia is, as a matter of fact, where we wanted to do the initial phase 2 trial for ALA. The reason for that is not because of Cortexa. We planned this before the Australian market opened. The reason is because Australia gives you a 43% rebate on all of your clinical trial work, and we wanted the money. But I think it does open up a bunch of opportunities. The other super interesting thing for us looking at Australia is, ALA is a novel and enantiomeric mix of MDMA, but it has the same constituent parts as MDMA. And so really, really interesting for me to see, like, the Australian regulations did not say, racemic MDMA is approved for use. These are unapproved drugs. There is no approval, just said MDMA. And ALA is a variant of MDMA. So I don't know, we're not going to rush into anything, but I'd be very, very curious to see how the Australian TGA reacts to us proposing, hey, listen, we have this clinical evidence. We actually think that we should be able to put ALA into the market in Australia. And we do not have an answer on that yet, but it's a good idea.
That'll be an interesting argument to try, certainly. Because it is MDMA. Yeah.
It is MDMA. It's just a novel form of MDMA. That's right. Do you guys want to talk about sort of US versus Canada versus UK?
The headline is that there's a lot of divergence, really. There's very different approaches being taken. Everyone regulates pharmaceuticals quite tightly, and it's a well-regulated industry around the world, but the approach that's taken can vary quite dramatically, and there are different kind of factors at play. We've already talked about the FDA's approach, and with their position as being the regulator in the USA, they can force people through or encourage people through the most expensive and most involved process, because it's the largest target market, it's the biggest market, it's a big prize, and they can be quite, they can set the terms really. And then you see places like Australia with their rebate program incentivizing more research in their jurisdiction and trying to encourage people to domicile their drugs in Australia. So other jurisdictions have to try and do things to attract business, whereas the US, is a magnet for this kind of business already. And
you're coming to the US whether you like it or not. It's the world's biggest drug market, so you're going to go there.
And then the UK is just drifting off the edge of Europe, and as a result, it's putting itself in an interesting position where we're now trying to be more attractive as a jurisdiction in which to conduct clinical research, starting to diverge in policy and regulation from the continent. And that creates a great degree of unknown around what's going to happen. But divergence is what's happening. So there will be differences from the UK and Europe, and those differences seem like they will grow rather than shrink. So we have to go through quite an involved process with our clients to determine the right regulatory pathway for them. And there are different factors, be that cost, complexity, issues around what will be approved from an ethical standpoint. There are significant differences between these markets, even in the ones that have been mentioned, which are all large developed economies regulators.
And there's two different aspects as well to look at the kind of regulatory landscape. One is drug approval and the other is clinical trial approval. And they have very different considerations. So whereas there might be kind of divergence in drug approval approaches, when it comes to kind of clinical trial approval, there's a whole load of other considerations. So this is where I think the UK stands out as being a pretty dense island when it comes to population. So our trial site is located in the middle of London, which is 10 million people. We have a kind of more people within an hour of our site than I think there is in kind of the whole of Australia. So it means that from a clinical trial approval approach, where recruitment is obviously one of the biggest bottlenecks, the UK kind of stands out as being a very useful location from a kind of practical point of view.
And then I think the last part of the question was on MAPS, and hopefully a MAPS approval would influence the space positively.
A MAPS disapproval would definitely influence the space negatively. That's for sure.
It certainly would, because if they've been at this since whatever it is, 1987, and then they don't get an approval, you can see how that might turn off some investors and operators. But I hope that they're not judged.
I got to be honest. So this is just my perspective, but if MAPS, after getting over $100 million in charitable donations with which to fund their trial, and raising a further like $70 million through, they did like a regenerative vine, basically they mortgaged their future profits for cash to fund their clinical research. If with all that money and all that time and all that expertise, they are not successful, I would really, really worry about the future of the industry, if not for Australia. Because the one thing that MAPS did, which was like a great service, I think, to humanity, is they published all their research. And so it's not hidden. And so regulators like Australia can utilize that body of scientific evidence to now just say, this drug is allowed. We're gonna say yes. And I do think there's going to be other countries, like, even if MAPS does not get approved, and I think that they should. The evidence seems like incredibly persuasive. But even if in the US they are not approved, there will be other countries who just like allow MDMA therapy because they need to treat people.
And I hope investors and market analysts give them some time around the commercialization, because we saw a lot of negativity post-approval and commercialization of Spravato, but that now has picked up considerably. And these aren't going to be easy treatments to commercialize, but that doesn't mean they're not commercializable. It means there's a lot of groundwork that needs doing. And so, it probably take a while to pick up pace, but the buoyancy for the market in terms of this is an achievable goal, getting market authorization for these kind of treatments, I think will be, totally a huge impact.
Actually, like, so on the market access piece, which is like, and I say this a lot, but I think most investors have no idea about how long the timeline is to get the market access. Like, getting your drug approved is literally just like, like the day after your drug gets approved is like the day after your wedding. You still have like the entirety of the marriage ahead of you. I did have a conversation in Australia recently with an insurance company, and they provide a lot of auto insurance in Australia. And because of the nature of car accidents, they deal with like a lot of PTSD cases. And the guy was like, oh yeah, we were walking through just like the rough math of how much it's going to cost. And I sort of said, well, I think it's going to be between 15 and 20,000 Australian dollars per patient for PTSD treatment with MDMA. And I expected like a lot of pushback. And he was like, oh yeah, that's fine. Like, great number. I was like, really? Great number? He's like, oh yeah, because if you add together like regular talk therapy, which we were already reimbursed, right? Because there is no other treatment available. And then like, we'll probably put them on antidepressants. So there'll be a charge for the drug there. And so like, if these are actual functional treatments that will put somebody into like, extinguish their PTSD, that's like 6 months of treatment in like traditional treatment. So you're saying that like we can basically cure them for that amount of money? Yeah, cool. We're down. Like, where can I sign? Yeah. So that was actually very, very nice to hear from an insurer.
That kind of economic evaluation piece that needs to be obviously conducted across the entire sector is one that is absolutely necessary to allow kind of rollout, because that's where you can understand what the pinch points are and what needs to be made more efficient, where actually there is some kind of leeway and where the sensitivities are, and that's not really been conducted.
MAPS has done some economic analysis work. It's not, I think, where it needs to be yet. And the other problem with it, honestly, is it was done in the United States, and the United States, as I think we all know, is not the regular market across most of the world. Like, I think you need to do this kind of economic analysis in like a socialized medicine country like the UK or Canada or Australia, although Australia has like a hybrid system. But I think really, really important, like, look, once governments see how much money they can save, that's where you'll really get a push for approval, because we spend a lot of money and we don't get a lot for it.
Absolutely.
Okay, one last question, and then we will shut this down. This has been going longer than most of our webinars. That's good. We got a lot to talk about.
This is coming from Anonymous. Can you share any timelines for the development of ALA 002?
Yeah. This is for us, of course. Yeah, we hope to be in a phase 2 clinical trial by the end of this year in Australia with the University of Sydney, which is sort of our research partner on this. There's a great researcher out there that we've been talking to for a long time, and we're just in the middle of designing the trial and getting everything ready for it. But yeah, hope to be in clinical trial this year. Fingers crossed. Maybe early next year. We'll see how it goes. And with that, I think we're going to call it a day. Guys, thanks so much for doing this. This is great.
Thank you.
Yeah. So check out Clerkenwell. If you are doing any clinical research or you want to engage with regulators, check in with Clerkenwell, because we did, and we're very pleased with it. And we'll talk soon.
Wonderful plug. Thank you, Nick. And if you're in need of MDMA in Australia, clinical
I expect the same in return when we next see each other in London.
Yeah, for sure.
All righty, guys. Thanks so much. Cheers.